Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the British Empire, how a small island conquered the world. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The fog is coming in off the Thames. It moves slowly, the way it always has in this city, rolling up from the dark water in soft grey curtains that swallow the gas lamps one by one and turn their light into pale halos suspended in the dark. The river smells of salt and coal smoke and something older, mud, tidal mud, the grey-brown mud of the estuary that the river has been depositing along its banks since long before any city stood here, since long before anyone thought to build on the low marshy ground at the point where the tidal reach gives way to fresh water. You are standing on a bridge above that river now, in the cool of an autumn evening, and the city spreads away from you in every direction, dark rooftops and chimney stacks fading into the mist, the distant sound of a bell marking the hour, the creak of timber from a vessel moored somewhere below you, the smell of bread baking in a nearby street. The water beneath the bridge is black and wide and patient, moving toward the sea with the slow authority of something that has been moving in exactly this direction for a very long time. Tonight we will travel slowly through the story of the British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever seen, a political and commercial structure that, at its greatest extent, covered roughly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface and encompassed something close to 500 million people. A structure so vast and so complex and so deeply woven into the fabric of the modern world that it is impossible to understand the century we live in without understanding something of how it grew, how it worked, how it changed the lives of everyone it touched, and how it finally, gradually, released its hold on the world and became something else, a memory, a legacy, a set of consequences still unfolding. We will not rush through any of it. Let the fire burn low and the evening deepen around you, and let this long, complicated, remarkable story carry you gently toward sleep. The island itself, England, and then Britain, is a small and somewhat improbable place from which to launch an empire of such dimensions. It sits off the northwest coast of Europe, separated from the continent by a channel that is, at its narrowest, barely 21 miles wide, a distance you could see across on a clear day, a distance that has been swum, and rowed, and eventually tunneled beneath. It is not a large island. It is not a particularly rich island, by the standards of the ancient world, no gold, no silver, no spices, no silk, no tropical abundance of the kind that dazzled European imaginations when the first explorers began returning from Asia and the Americas with their cargoes of wonder. What the island had, in the centuries when it was accumulating the conditions for empire, was something less glamorous and more fundamental, a long, deeply indented coastline full of natural harbors, a tradition of seafaring that reached back beyond recorded history, and a particular combination of commercial ambition and practical engineering that found its fullest expression in the building of ships. The Romans came first, as they came to so much of the ancient world. Julius Caesar crossed the Channel in 55 and 54 BC, more as a demonstration of reach than as a serious attempt at conquest, and for nearly a century the island remained at the edge of Roman attention. Then, under the Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, the legions came in earnest, and within a generation most of what is now England and Wales had been absorbed into the Roman province of Britannia. The Romans built roads that ran straight as arguments from one fortified town to the next, roads whose lines you can still trace in the modern landscape, in the long straight stretches of English country roads that seem to belong to a different geometry than the lanes and hedgerows around them. They built walls, most famously Hadrian's Wall in the north, that long stone boundary between the province and the unconquered highlands of what would become Scotland, running from the Solway Firth to the Tyne, a structure that still stands in long, melancholy sections across the high moorland of Northumberland, cold and grey and magnificent in the low light of a winter afternoon. Let the image of that wall settle in the mind for a moment, that long grey line crossing the windswept uplands, the heather on either side of it, the pewter sky above. The Romans who built it and garrisoned it were not Italians, mostly. They were soldiers from across the empire, from North Africa and Spain and the Rhine and the Danube, men who had never seen the island before and who died on it, many of them, and were buried in the cold northern ground far from any place they had ever thought of as home. Their tombstones survive in the museums of the border country, carved in the Roman style, with portraits and inscriptions in Latin, the names of men and women who lived and died at the outermost edge of the known world. There is something in those stones that speaks across the centuries with great clarity, the human cost of empire, paid in increments too small for history to fully account for. The Romans withdrew from Britannia in the early 5th century, pulled back toward the collapsing center of the empire, and behind them they left a vacuum that was filled slowly and violently over the next 2 centuries by waves of migration and invasion from the continent, Angles and Saxons and Jutes from the German coast and Jutland, peoples who spoke the Germanic languages from which English would eventually grow, who brought with them their own traditions and their own gods and their own way of organizing the land into kingdoms and estates and villages that would become, slowly, the basic geography of medieval England. The Viking raids began in the late 8th century, when Norse longships first appeared off the coasts of Northumbria and Lindisfarne, and they continued for 200 years, sometimes devastating, sometimes transformative, leaving behind in the north and east of England a density of Norse place names that persists to the present day, the By and the Thorpe and the Wick endings that dot the maps of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire and the old Danelaw territories like a permanent record of a people who settled and stayed. The night is very still. Let the river come back to you, the dark water, the moving tide, the distant bell somewhere upstream marking the hour with the same unhurried patience it has marked every hour for as long as anyone in this city can remember. The city is quieter now than it was an hour ago, the streets beginning to empty, the last carts rattling home over the cobblestones, the last voices fading into doorways and up staircases into lit rooms. The fog has thickened and the lights along the embankment are soft and indistinct, smeared by the moisture in the air into orange blurs that illuminate nothing clearly but make the darkness visible, each lamp a small warm planet in its own private atmosphere of yellow light. On the river, a waterman is crossing from one bank to the other, his oars dipping in slow rhythm, the sound of them arriving a beat after the sight of them in the way that sound and sight separate at a distance, at night, in fog. He does not look up. He is thinking about something else entirely, the way people on rivers always seem to be thinking about something else entirely. Breathe in the cool of the evening. There is no rush in any of this. The story is long and it will keep. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought the last successful invasion of England and introduced into the island a ruling class that spoke French, thought in French, organized its law and its literature and its architecture according to French and continental models, and regarded the Anglo-Saxon population it had conquered with a mixture of contempt and pragmatic accommodation. William the Conqueror built castles, the square stone keeps of Norman military architecture, planted at strategic points across the landscape, permanent and unmistakable assertions of a new order. He ordered the Domesday Book, that remarkable survey of the land and its resources completed in 1086, a document of extraordinary ambition, a complete accounting of who owned what, how much it was worth, how many peasants worked it, how many plough teams it could support. It is a document that reads, even now, as an act of mastery, an assertion that the new rulers knew their territory down to its last acre and its last ox, that nothing was beyond their knowledge or their reach. The island that emerged from these successive waves of invasion and settlement, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Norse, Norman, was not a simple place. It was a palimpsest, a surface on which many different histories had been written and not quite erased, where the Latin of the church sat alongside the English of the village and the French of the court, where the straight Roman roads ran through a landscape otherwise organized by Anglo-Saxon habit and Norse memory. This complexity, this layering of languages and legal traditions and cultural inheritances, was not a weakness. It was, in some ways, an early preparation for empire. A society that had absorbed so many different peoples and organized them into something functional, something that functioned well enough to survive and eventually to expand, had developed, through that long process of absorption and adaptation, a particular kind of institutional flexibility that would prove extraordinarily useful when the time came to manage territories far more various and far more distant than a few hundred miles of Channel coast. The sea was always the key. Let your mind move outward from the river now, following the Thames as it widens through the estuary and enters the open water of the North Sea, the cold, grey, rough-weathered sea of the northern latitudes, the sea that English and Dutch and Hanseatic fishermen and merchants had been working for centuries before anyone thought of crossing the Atlantic. English sailors were not, by the 15th century, timid men. They had been fishing the North Sea and the waters around Iceland for generations, working in conditions that would have seemed extreme to Mediterranean sailors: long swells, sudden storms, winter darkness, the particular cold of northern water. They had developed, in response to those conditions, ships that were broader and deeper than Mediterranean vessels, built to carry heavy cargo through rough weather rather than to skim lightly over calm water. These ships would become, in modified form, the instruments of empire. The Portuguese and Spanish moved first, in the great age of European oceanic expansion that began in the mid-15th century. Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492. Vasco da Gama reached India by sea in 1498. These voyages transformed the commercial geography of the world with a speed that contemporaries found almost impossible to absorb. The old land routes through Central Asia and the Middle East, the spice routes that had sustained the trading cities of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, were suddenly redundant, bypassed by sea routes that could carry far larger quantities of goods far more cheaply. the center of European commerce began to shift from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast, and the nations with the best Atlantic harbors, Portugal, Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, found themselves positioned at the edge of a new world whose dimensions were only beginning to be understood. England's entry into this oceanic world was tentative at first. John Cabot sailed from Bristol in 1497 and reached North America, likely Newfoundland or Cape Breton, claiming it for the English crown, but nothing followed immediately from that landfall. England in the early 16th century was a relatively minor power, preoccupied with its own religious upheavals, the Reformation under Henry VIII, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the extraordinary violence of the mid-century religious reversals, and with the geopolitics of the European continent, where France and the Habsburgs were locked in a struggle that made everything else seem secondary. It was not until the reign of Elizabeth I, in the second half of the 16th century, that English ambition began to turn seriously and systematically toward the sea and what lay beyond it. Let the city settle around you again. The fog is very thick now and the river is barely visible, just a dark suggestion below the parapet of the bridge, a sound more than a sight, the slapping of water against stone, the distant creak of rigging, the low groan of a mooring line under tension. The air is cool and damp on your face. Your breathing has slowed. The evening has gone quiet in the way that city evenings go quiet when the fog comes in, muffled, contained, as though the whole world has drawn a curtain around itself and retreated into private warmth. Let the warmth of wherever you are carry you gently forward. The Elizabethan seamen, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, Raleigh, were not, by any honest account, gentle men. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, returning to Plymouth with a ship so loaded with Spanish silver and gold that Elizabeth I came aboard personally to knight him on his own quarter-deck. He was, from the Spanish perspective, a pirate, and the distinction between Elizabethan privateering and outright piracy was largely a matter of which flag you were flying and whether the Queen had issued you a letter of marque. John Hawkins pioneered the English involvement in the transatlantic slave trade in the 1560s, carrying enslaved people from West Africa to the Spanish Caribbean in voyages that established patterns of commerce and violence that would define the Atlantic world for the next 3 centuries. These are facts that belong in the story of the British Empire from the very beginning, not as accusations to be thrown at the past but as part of the full and honest account of how the empire was built and what it cost the people who were not building it. The East India Company was founded in 1600, on the last day of that year, by a royal charter from Elizabeth I granting a group of London merchants the exclusive right to trade with the East Indies, the vague and capacious term that covered everything from India to Indonesia and beyond. It was a commercial enterprise, not a military one, at least in its original conception, a joint stock company, owned by shareholders who pooled their capital and shared the risks and profits of individual voyages, a structure that had been pioneered by the Dutch and that would prove to be one of the most consequential organizational inventions in the history of capitalism. The company's early years were focused on the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, competing, often violently, with the Dutch East India Company for control of the nutmeg and clove trade that commanded extraordinary prices in European markets. It was not until the early 17th century, after a series of defeats at Dutch hands in the Indonesian archipelago, that the English company turned its attention more fully toward India. India in the early 17th century was not a vacuum waiting to be filled. It was one of the most populous, most productive, and most sophisticated regions of the world, home to the Mughal Empire, which at its height under Akbar and his successors governed a subcontinent of perhaps 150 million people, supported a court of extraordinary cultural richness, and produced textiles and metalwork and agricultural output on a scale that made the European visitors who encountered it feel, many of them, that they had arrived at the center of the world rather than at its periphery. The East India Company's first foothold on the subcontinent was modest, a trading post, a factory in the commercial sense of the word, which meant a place where factors, or merchants, lived and conducted their business, at Surat on the western coast, established in 1613 after a naval skirmish in which English ships repelled a Portuguese fleet and impressed the Mughal governor enough to grant trading rights. More trading posts followed, Madras in 1639, Bombay transferred to the English crown as part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry when she married Charles II in 1661 and then leased to the company for £10 of gold per year, Calcutta in 1690. These were, for much of the 17th century, genuinely commercial operations, warehouses and residences and quaysides, staffed by company servants who lived in the margins of the great Indian polities around them, dependent on Mughal tolerance, subject to Indian law, operating through a dense network of Indian merchants and bankers and brokers without whom the trade could not have functioned at all. The image of the lone English merchant single-handedly mastering India is a mythology that grew up later, in retrospect, to explain an outcome that was not inevitable and that no one in 1650 or 1700 could have predicted with any confidence. The change came slowly and then all at once, as such changes tend to. The Mughal Empire began its long decline in the early 18th century. The death of Aurangzeb in 1707 triggered a succession of weak emperors and ambitious governors, the fracturing of central authority, the rise of regional powers like the Marathas and the Nawabs of Bengal and the Nizam of Hyderabad who competed with each other and with various European trading companies for influence and territory. The East India Company, which had by then acquired its own private army and its own fortifications, found itself drawn into these conflicts, first as a participant, then as a kingmaker, then as something increasingly indistinguishable from a sovereign power. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, in which Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, with a force partly composed of Indian soldiers fighting under company command, is usually taken as the moment when the company ceased to be simply a trading enterprise and became, in fact if not yet in name, a territorial power. Robert Clive himself is one of the figures in British imperial history whose life resists simple summary. He arrived in India at 18 as a company clerk, bookish, melancholy, prone to depression, a man who had attempted suicide twice before he was 20 and who would attempt it successfully at 49, and discovered in himself, in the particular circumstances of India in the 1740s, a gift for military command and political manipulation that he had no way of anticipating in advance. He was brave in ways that shaded into recklessness, shrewd in ways that shaded into corruption, effective in ways that extracted an enormous personal fortune from the territories he administered while contributing, genuinely and consequentially, to the expansion of company power. Parliament investigated him twice for corruption. He defended himself with the famous phrase that given the wealth available to him he was astonished at his own moderation. Whether that was braggadocio or a genuine reflection on the scale of opportunity the subcontinent presented to someone in his position, it is one of the more revealing statements in the whole literature of empire. Let the night deepen around you now. The river is still out there in the dark, still moving, still carrying its cargo of tidal water toward the sea with the same indifference it has always shown to the affairs of the people on its banks, the same river that Roman soldiers crossed on pontoon bridges, that Viking longships rowed up under cover of early morning, that the Tudor court rode in state barges with golden canopies, that the East India Company's ships departed from loaded with trade goods and ambition. The fog has settled on everything, on the bridge, on the rooftops, on the bare trees along the embankment, in a fine silver moisture that is just short of rain, that makes the stone surfaces glisten faintly in whatever light reaches them, that dampens sound and softens outline and makes the whole city feel, for a moment, like something in the process of dreaming itself. The smell of the river is stronger in the fog, that particular Thames smell of cold fresh water and tidal mud and the faint mineral sharpness of stone that has been wet for centuries. Your breathing is very easy. Let your body settle more deeply into wherever it rests, your shoulders releasing, your hands softening. The story is long and the night is generous, and there is no need to hold on to any of it too tightly. The loss of the American colonies in 1783, those 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard that declared independence in 1776 after a decade of escalating conflict over taxation and representation and the fundamental question of whether a parliament in London could legislate for people who had no voice in it, was a shock to British self-understanding of a kind that is difficult now to fully appreciate. These were not distant and alien territories governed by reluctant subjects. They were, in the minds of most people in Britain, English communities, communities of English descent, speaking English, governed by English common law, with the same fundamental liberties that the English at home took for themselves. The idea that they would separate, successfully, with French assistance, and establish a republic on principles that seemed, to many in the British establishment, dangerously radical, that was not a small thing. It was a rupture. And yet, in a pattern that would repeat itself across the following century and a half, the loss of one area of empire seemed to accelerate expansion elsewhere, as if the energies that had been invested in North America were redirected rather than dissipated. Australia was claimed beginning in 1778, Captain James Cook having surveyed its eastern coast in 1770. India continued its transformation from commercial enterprise to territorial empire, a process that would culminate in the formal transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown in 1858, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, an uprising of such scale and violence, and suppressed with such scale and violence, that it shook the entire structure of British India and led to its reorganization along more explicitly governmental lines. Ceylon, Singapore, large portions of southern Africa, pieces of the Caribbean, trading posts along the coast of West Africa, the map of British influence spread across the world in the decades after American independence like water finding its level, filling every available depression in the geopolitical landscape. The Industrial Revolution transformed the empire, and the empire transformed the Industrial Revolution, the two processes so interwoven that it is genuinely difficult to say which caused which. The cotton mills of Lancashire ran on raw cotton grown in India and Egypt and the American South, and the cotton goods they produced flowed back out along the same trading networks. The railways that were built across India beginning in the 1850s, eventually the largest railway network in Asia, 100,000 miles of track laid through subcontinent by mostly Indian labour under British engineering supervision, served commercial interests first and imperial control second, and the distinction between the two was often, in practice, invisible. The telegraph cables that were laid under the oceans beginning in the 1860s connected London to Bombay, to Cape Town, to Sydney, to Singapore, in a communications network of astonishing speed that allowed the colonial governors to receive instructions from the imperial centre within hours rather than months, and that transformed, fundamentally, the nature of imperial administration. Imagine the map as it looked in 1890, that famous map, reproduced in schoolrooms across the empire, on which the British territories were coloured red, the Imperial Convention, so that you could track the reach of the empire across every continent at a glance. Canada to the north, massive and cold and largely empty by European standards, its southern border the longest undefended frontier in the world. The Caribbean islands, small and sugar-producing and haunted by the memory of slavery abolished 60 years before. British Guiana on the South American coast. The dense network of West African territories, Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, Nigeria, Gambia, acquired through a combination of anti-slavery patrols, commercial treaties, and the eventually irresistible pressure of the late 19th century scramble for Africa. South Africa, incorporating the older Cape Colony and the newly conquered Boer republics after the brutal South African War of 1899 to 1902. East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, and the Great White Highlands of the interior, where European settlers would carve out farms and ranches on land taken from people who had been farming it in their own way for generations. Egypt, nominally independent, practically a protectorate. India, the jewel in the crown, as Disraeli's rhetoric had it, and behind India the further territories of Burma and Malaya and Singapore and Hong Kong, strung along the sea routes toward Australia and New Zealand, those other settler colonies where English people had gone and built something that looked, from a distance, more or less like England, except for the light. The light in these places was nothing like the English light. Let that thought settle for a moment. The extraordinary variety of sky and sun and air that the empire encompassed, the difference between the grey soft light of an English November and the white hot noon of Rajasthan, or the long golden light of an Australian summer evening when the gum trees cast shadows like compass needles pointing west, or the particular equatorial light of Singapore at the end of the monsoon, when the air is so clean and so heavy with moisture that it intensifies every color to something that looks almost artificial, the greens too green and the sky too blue and the flowering trees along the colonial avenues too vivid to be real. Or the light of the Cape of Good Hope in the late afternoon, that famous light that moves across the flat-topped mountain and the bay below it in long horizontal bands of gold and copper, so clear that you can see individual buildings on the far shore and the white sails of fishing boats far out in the Atlantic. Or the light of the Canadian prairie in autumn, that enormous light falling over an enormous flatness, the sky taking up 4/5 of the visible world and filled with a quality of illumination that has no equivalent anywhere in England, that makes English people who encounter it for the first time feel that they have arrived somewhere genuinely new, somewhere the sky was not yet finished being invented. The men and women who moved between these places, soldiers and administrators and traders and missionaries and engineers and teachers and planters and surveyors, carried England with them in their habits and their food and their architecture and their furniture and their social rituals, building bungalows and clubs and garden parties and cricket pitches in the most unlikely climates, surrounding themselves with the familiar in places that were profoundly and irreducibly unfamiliar. And the places changed them, too, more than the official history of empire for a long time acknowledged. The children born in India who grew up speaking Hindustani before they spoke English, stepping between languages the way adults step between rooms, entirely fluent in both and belonging completely to neither. The families who served generation after generation on the subcontinent, accumulating a knowledge of Indian landscapes and customs and languages that no amount of time in England could reproduce, and who came home finally, to retirement in Bath or Cheltenham or the home counties, as strangers in the country they nominally belonged to, missing the heat, missing the smell of the earth after rain in the hot season, missing the particular weight and density of a world that was not theirs and that they missed anyway, as deeply and as helplessly as anyone misses a place they love. Let your breathing slow down here, in the quiet of the evening. The river is very patient. The fog has thinned slightly and you can see, now, the dark shapes of buildings on the far bank, warehouses, maybe, or wharves, their windows dark, their stone walls black with the accumulated soot of a century of coal fires. The city breathes around you in its sleep, thousands of hearths still warm, thousands of lives laid down for the night in rooms you will never see. There is something comforting in the scale of it, the sheer number of people sharing this night, each in their own particular darkness, each carried toward the same quiet place by the same slow hours. Victoria was crowned Queen in 1837 and would remain on the throne until 1901, 63 years, the longest reign in British history to that point, an era of such change that those born in its first years and still alive in its last could barely recognize the world they had grown up in. She was 18 when she became Queen, small and composed and already aware of the weight of what she was inheriting. She would become, over the decades of her reign, the symbolic center of an empire that was expanding in all directions at once, the figure whose portrait appeared on the stamps and the coins of a dozen different countries, whose birthday was celebrated with gun salutes in Calcutta and Cape Town and Ottawa and Sydney, whose name was attached to lakes and rivers and mountain ranges and cities and railway stations on every continent. Whether she was the cause of any of this or merely its icon is a question that Victorian propagandists and later historians have argued about without resolution, but the fact of her presence, steady, formidable, increasingly ancient, stubbornly permanent, gave the empire a human face and a narrative coherence that a committee or a company could never have provided. The people who actually built and sustained the empire on the ground were overwhelmingly ordinary, not the Drakes and Clives and Wellingtons whose names appear in the histories, but the clerks and sergeants and district officers and telegraph operators and railway surveyors and missionary school teachers and merchant sailors whose individual lives were too numerous and too undramatic to be recorded in detail. A young man from Glasgow or Bristol or a Shropshire farm might find himself posted, in his 20s, to a sub-district of Bengal or a hill station in Burma or a trading post in Nigeria, responsible for collecting taxes and settling disputes and maintaining the roads and administering justice in a language he might have only partial command of, among people whose customs and beliefs and social structures he was expected to understand and navigate and govern. Some did this badly, with cruelty or indifference. Some did it well, with genuine respect and genuine competence. Most did it with the mixture of good intentions and limited understanding that characterizes most human beings operating in circumstances beyond their full comprehension. And behind those men were the women who rarely appear in the official histories at all, wives who followed postings to climates that killed European constitutions with tropical disease, who raised children in bungalows while their husbands toured distant districts, who ran households across vast cultural distances with a combination of authority and dependence that the colonial situation made simultaneously possible and precarious. Missionaries' wives who established schools and medical dispensaries alongside their husbands' churches. Memsahibs, the Anglo-Indian term for European women in India, who negotiated daily life in a society that was never quite home, learning enough of the local language to manage a household, developing relationships with the Indian women who worked within it that were shaped by the enormous inequalities of the colonial situation and that were also, sometimes, genuinely warm, genuinely complicated, genuinely human in the way that relationships between people who spend their days in close proximity tend to become, regardless of what the surrounding structures say about the hierarchy between them. The Indian Civil Service, the ICS, that famous institution, known in its own mythology as the steel frame that held India together, recruited through competitive examination beginning in 1853, selecting each year a small number of young men from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge who would spend their careers in India, learning one or more Indian languages, moving through a succession of postings that might take them from a remote district collectorship to a position in the provincial secretariat to the governor's council, accumulating a knowledge of their territory that was, in many cases, genuinely deep and genuinely valuable, and that was also, inescapably, the knowledge of an outsider looking in, translating what they saw through the lens of a training and a culture that was not indigenous to the place they governed. The contradictions of this position, the genuine competence and genuine ignorance existing simultaneously in the same person, run through the literature of British India like a fault line, visible in the novels and memoirs and administrative reports that the ICS produced in such extraordinary quantity. Let your mind rest now from the weight of all these names and dates and structures. Let the fog come back, the river fog, the cool evening fog of a city at the end of the day, drifting up from the water and softening everything it touches. The bridge beneath your feet is solid stone, worn smooth by the feet of a million crossings made over centuries by people who never thought about the fact that they were crossing the same bridge, breathing the same air, looking at the same dark water as everyone who had crossed before them. Below you the river is moving very slowly in the dark, carrying on its surface small pieces of debris, a leaf, a fragment of wood, something white and indistinct that catches for a moment against a pier and then releases and moves on. The river does not hold anything longer than it needs to. It receives what comes to it and carries it forward and releases it to the sea, which is a way of doing things that the river has practiced for a very long time and that it does without effort. The water does not know anything about the empire. It has been moving through this landscape since long before any empire was imagined, and it will move through it long after the last trace of empire has been absorbed into the ordinary texture of the world, into the languages people speak and the laws they live under and the cups of tea they make in the morning without thinking about where tea came from or how it got here. The empire, for all its power and all its reach, was never experienced as a single thing. It was experienced as 1,000 different things, in 1,000 different places, by people whose relationships to it were as various as the places themselves. In the Caribbean, the descendants of enslaved people who had been transported across the Atlantic against their will in the holds of ships now lived in islands administered by a government in London that had abolished the institution of slavery in 1833, a government that had compensated the slaveholders for the loss of their property at a cost of £20 million. A sum so large that the British government only finished paying off the loan used to fund it in 2015, while the enslaved people themselves received nothing. In Australia, Aboriginal communities whose ancestors had lived on the continent for more than 60,000 years found themselves dispossessed of land, prohibited from practicing their ceremonies in some jurisdictions, their children removed by government policy to be raised in institutions designed to make them forget who they were. These are not peripheral footnotes to the story of the British Empire. They are central to it, as central as the railways and the telegraph cables and the free trade treaties and the English common law. And alongside all of this, running through it, inseparable from it, the genuine complexity of what was built. The legal systems that became the foundations of independent nations after decolonization. The universities and hospitals and engineering schools established in India and Africa and elsewhere that educated generations of people who would lead independence movements against the very empire that had built the institutions that educated them. The natural scientists and archaeologists and linguists who documented and preserved knowledge about the places they inhabited, imperfectly, with biases shaped by their training and their time, but with a thoroughness that has left behind a record of extraordinary breadth. The literature, not just the literature by British writers about empire, but the literature that emerged from the encounter between English language and Indian and African and Caribbean minds, the new literatures of the post-colonial world that are now among the most vital and interesting bodies of writing on Earth. The 20th century took the empire apart, not all at once but in stages, with a combination of exhaustion and conviction and political pressure that accumulated across the decades after the First World War. India was the hinge. The Indian independence movement, shaped most lastingly by Mohandas Gandhi, a Gujarati lawyer who had spent years in South Africa and who returned to India in 1915 to lead a campaign of non-violent resistance that combined deep moral seriousness with extraordinary political shrewdness, changed the terms of the debate about empire in ways that could not be undone. Gandhi's method was to refuse, consistently and publicly and with perfect dignity, to cooperate with the machinery of British rule, and to invite the violence that refusal attracted so that the world could see clearly what the maintenance of empire required. The Salt March of 1930, in which Gandhi and a small group of followers walked 240 miles to the sea to make salt in defiance of the British salt monopoly, was an act of political theatre so perfectly conceived and so perfectly executed that it made the front pages of newspapers across the world and demonstrated, with great clarity, that the moral authority of the empire was not inexhaustible. India became independent in August of 1947, partitioned into two nations, India and Pakistan, in a division that was accompanied by one of the largest mass migrations in human history and by communal violence that killed somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people, the estimates varying enormously because the violence was too widespread and too chaotic to be accurately counted. The partition was rushed, the boundary commission's lines, drawn largely by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe who had never been to India before and would never return after, were announced 2 days after independence, meaning that people in the Punjab and Bengal had already been celebrating the independence of one country or the other before they knew whether their village or their farm or their street was on their side of the line or the other. The speed of the departure was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential decisions in the whole history of decolonization, and its consequences are still unresolved in the relationship between India and Pakistan today. The rest followed over the next 3 decades, some transitions peaceful, some not, most somewhere in between. Ghana in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African country to become independent, its independence celebrated with a speech by its first Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah, that began with the words, "The long-sought goal in our strife has at last been achieved." Nigeria in 1960. Kenya in 1963, after the Mau Mau emergency of the 1950s, which the British had suppressed with a brutality, detention camps, systematic torture, forced removals, that the full extent of which only became clear decades later when the government archives were finally opened. Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, in 1980, after a guerrilla war that had lasted 15 years. Hong Kong, the last significant territory, handed back to China in 1997 in a ceremony attended by Charles, Prince of Wales, in the rain, the British flag lowered for the last time as the band played and the harbour lights reflected off the wet tarmac. Let the night come fully now. The river is very dark below the bridge and the fog has settled into permanence, the kind of fog that will not lift until morning, that makes the city into a collection of sounds and faint lights rather than a visible thing. Your breathing is slow and very even. The story has run its long course, from those Roman legions crossing the Channel to the flag coming down in Hong Kong, from the first tentative English trading posts in India to the independence celebrations in Ghana, from the sea venture wrecked on the Bermuda Reefs to the last governor's speech at the final handover. It is a story that contains multitudes, as all genuine histories do, cruelty and achievement, loss and creation, the full range of what human beings are capable of when they are given enormous power over other people and the distance and the institutional permission to exercise it. What remains is everywhere and ordinary, now, in the English spoken as a working language on every continent, in the parliamentary systems modelled on Westminster that govern countries whose founders fought against the Westminster Parliament to establish them, in the cricket played on village grounds in Barbados and Bengal and New Zealand, in the legal traditions and the university structures and the railway gauges and the left-hand side of the road in India and Australia and Kenya and Jamaica, in the diaspora communities in London and Birmingham and Manchester who have changed those cities as profoundly as those cities' histories changed their ancestors' homelands, in the literature and the music and the food that flows continuously in all directions along the channels that empire opened up and that independence did not close. The world does not look the way it looks without the British Empire. It would not be what it is without the people who resisted it and the people who dismantled it. All of it, the building and the reckoning, is part of a single long story that the present is still in the middle of telling. The night is very deep now. The Thames is out there in the fog, patient and dark, moving with the same inexorable purpose it has always had, toward the estuary, toward the sea, toward the wide salt water that connects this small island to every other piece of land on earth. The tide is turning, as it turns 4 times in every 24 hours, reversing direction with the gravitational pull of a moon that does not know or care about empires, that has been pulling this water back and forth across the mudflats of the estuary since before any city was built on these banks, since before any ship was launched from them. The river carries no message and keeps no record. It simply moves, as rivers do, toward the sea. Let your body go now. Let it sink into the warmth of wherever it rests tonight, the particular and familiar weight of a pillow, the soft resistance of a mattress that has learned your shape from every night you have slept on it. Your shoulders are heavy. Your arms are heavy. The muscles of your jaw have unclenched and your expression has gone smooth and still, the expression of someone who has already released the day and begun the long drift downward toward the place where thought becomes image and image becomes nothing at all. Somewhere out on the river, a boat is passing. You can hear it, just barely, through the fog, the low throb of an engine and then the slap of its wake against the stone of the embankment below you. It does not stop. It moves on through the dark, as boats have always moved through this water, through the centuries and the fogs and the fires and the changes, through everything that has happened on the banks of this river and will happen, carrying whatever it carries toward wherever it is going. Sleep. The city is very quiet now. The fog lies over everything like a blanket, over the rooftops and the bridges and the wide dark river, over the whole long complicated history that this small island carries with it through time. The stars are above the fog somewhere, patient and indifferent, doing their own slow work. The river moves toward the sea. The water. The fog. The quiet. Let go.